everyone today to our Read Ballarat event for Term 3. It's been a little while since we've had a Read Ballarat, so super excited to have Trisha Jha present to us today. So Trisha Jha is a research fellow in the education program for the Centre of Independent Studies. She works on lots of projects relating to the science of learning, improvement of initial teacher education, and overall school quality. And as we get started, I would like to acknowledge the Wadawurrung people, who are the traditional custodians of the land that I'm meeting on in Ballarat, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today, and acknowledge the traditional custodians for all the lands of where we're meeting. So prior to rejoining the Centre of Independent Studies, Trisha has roles as secondary teaching, including through the Teach for Australia program at Horsham, and also at Clarendon College in Ballarat. She has worked as a policy advisor, holds a Masters of Teaching with specialisation in research from Deakin Uni, and a Bachelor of Arts in International Relations from the Australian National University. Trisha has written many publications for the Centre of Independent Studies, but most recently in 2024 and 2025 around learning lessons and implementing the science of learning. And what is the science of learning? You can check out Trisha on some podcasts with the Centre of Independent Studies, and also from a couple of my favourites, The Knowledge for Teachers and Progressively Incorrect. And Trisha has also done a latest commentary just on August 16th, so a few days ago, about lifting NAPLAN results and what happens in the classroom matters most. And we're thrilled to have her today, and also very lucky that she's a Ballarat local. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Trisha.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, for that very warm welcome. I am really thrilled to be able to do this, because it's just really nice to be able to work with teachers and sort of support people to understand something that is not really easy to do in the day-to-day job of teaching. So it's something that obviously affects all of us. How's the education system going overall? But something that obviously, it's something the teachers get talked about in the media around this, rather than being able to engage productively with these conversations themselves. So I think someone's just mute. I'm just going to mute someone there. And yeah, so today, basically, my goal is for you guys to become more informed. What tests do we do? What do they measure? How can we use the data, like yeses and nos for using the data? And then obviously just looking at the outcomes. So the trends in achievement, we're going to look at Australia first and then Victoria. I feel like I don't really need to cover this stuff really, because Kathleen's already covered it. I taught at Horsham College and ran the Spanish program there, taught at Clarendon for a little while. I was in the history faculty. I've bounced around between research and teaching. My work at the moment, so the main project that I'm sort of working on is around science of learning and implementation, but just because I've taught exclusively in regional Victoria, and I'm very much a regional Vic convert from growing up in Sydney, I'm really passionate about regional education, and just having walked, kind of both sides of the fence in teaching and research, very interested in that research to practice pipeline and how we translate, when there's a really strong body of evidence, how do we get that into kind of teacher knowledge and into teacher practice? So today I'm going to be talking, first of all, about what are the goals of the education system and what are the testing regimes that we do, and and obviously the goals kind of affects what we measure. What are the results from some of these tests? So we're going to look at the current NAPLAN, so the one that came out, just last week as well as last year, the older NAPLAN, so the older time series, PISA and PEARLS. And if some of those acronyms mean nothing to you, strap in, because we're going to learn all about it. And then we're going to do deep dive into Victoria. And I want to do that because obviously when we talk about results in the national context, it gets talked about in the national context, and it's very hard for us to sort of understand how this applies to Victoria. And we don't tend to get much Victorian specific kind of commentary. So I'm hoping that we can sort of bridge that gap today. Now, one of the things that I wanted to do to kind of make this a bit more interactive, there's like, I've got some slides or text boxes that have blue text. And basically, if you see blue text, that's something that you can engage with. So you can pop something in the chat if you want, or some of you might be in rooms with other people where you want to chat to each other, or, you know, you might just be driving home from work or whatever and just be like, oh, I think the answer is this. And just however you want to engage, as much or as little as you like. So we've got our giant table now of assessment programs, and there's a really big alphabet soup of acronyms. I can see that some people, like maybe some people are like listening as they're going on, so we'll just read out the first column. So the ones that we look at, the ones that are sort of covered in this table, we've got PISA, the Program of International Student Assessment, PIRLS, the Progress in International Reading Literacy Study, TIMS, the Trend in International Maths and Science Study, NAPLAN, which is our National Assessment Program, the Literacy and Numeracy, and then we've got the National Assessment Program Sample. And that sample one, and we already know what the main NAPLAN is, but the sample covers science, literacy, civics and citizenship, ICT. And PISA has 3 domains across reading, mathematics and science. Now, basically the key takeaway from the table is that pretty much between year 3 and year 10, regardless of whether it's NAPLAN or one of the international assessments, we get a bit of a picture of how every year level is doing at least every 5 years. So whether that's, you know, we get year 4 and year 8 from TIMS, or we get year 10 students, because that's what year 10 students from PISA, we get quite a broad representation. Now, the only of one of these tests that is a census, which is to say that all students do it, is NAPLAN. And that's important because that's why that's the one that our policymakers take the most seriously. So some of our quick engagement rapid fire questions. I'm going to pause for maybe a couple of seconds between each. Maths and science achievement at year 4 and year 8. Which test measures this? It's the TIMS, the Trends in International Maths and Science Study. A test of 15-year-olds with 3 domains. Which test is it? That's PISA, the Program for International Student Assessment. PIRLS, what does it measure? It measures the reading literacy of year 4 students every 5 years. And the only test that all students take, as we already know, is NAPLAN. Now, it's important to look at data and look at the fact that obviously with the international test, the Australian government is choosing to get Australian students involved. So they have to have a reason for that. Now, with any goal in any field, we want to have something to measure to check whether or not we're on track to meet it. So before we get stuck into the measures and what they're showing us, let's look at the goals. Now, there's 2 goals here from the Alice Springs Mbantua Declaration, which was signed in 2019. They sign one of these declarations approximately every 10 years. And the first goal, and that's the headline figure there, is the Australian education system promotes excellence and equity. And if you look in the tiny little text, there's a lot of fluff in there, particularly about, like, you know, individual abilities and interests and things like that, which kind of sets my alarm bells off. But the important stuff that really relates most strongly to that goal is ensuring that all young Australians of all backgrounds are supported to achieve their potential, that all students hold high expectations for their own educational outcomes, and that we promote a culture of excellence in all learning environments. So those are the things that I think are the key takeaways that we want to think about. And obviously, we use the data to track progress towards goals. And the 2 questions that we most want to get from all of this data is the excellence question. So how well are students being educated overall? And the second question, is that true for all students or just some, which is kind of the equity part of that domain. So testing data, do's and don'ts. Now, I think this is really important because we tend to find some of the things that I'm about to point to on the right definitely get committed every year. There's some testing, although I do my best in my commentary in the public sphere to avoid them. So the useful elements of testing, first of all, it's a bit of a health check of a system because education is really valued by the public, and because it's heavily valued by the public and it's a social good, it benefits everybody. We invest in it heavily, so it makes sense to have some sort of standardized testing as a health check. And this is particularly important when we're using that to either reflect on policy that's been implemented or we're looking to move forward on the policy space. And for that purpose, obviously, we need to look mostly at change over time. So basically, are we heading in the right direction or in the wrong direction? Where might we have gone wrong? Where can we go in the future? Because equity is one of our big concerns, we want to be able to measure the performance of different groups and measure whether there are equity gaps, so what's happening with our most vulnerable students, because sometimes you might have some headline figures that are really stable, but if you look underneath them, you find that, oh, actually there are certain groups of students that are really not doing as well. And this one is not as important, I guess, this is more of like the way that it can help us to understand individual school performance. It's a question of who's overcoming the odds. So the benefit from a research perspective of having those consistent data sets for all schools in the nation, you can analyze where the results are especially good. So maybe disadvantaged schools that are punching above their weight, or even some disadvantaged schools that, you know, might even be doing much better than more advantaged schools. So those are definitely the sorts of schools we want to hear from, right? Because we want to know who those schools are. We want to be able to go and like look under the hood and be like, excuse me, principal of this school, tell me what's going on. What's your secret recipe? On the other hand, if change over time is useful, change between individual years, not so much. The one exception to that is when we have some like gigantic thing that might influence the all of education and might influence education outcomes, like 2 years of remote learning. That might be an instance in which we want to look at that. But generally, no. Mean scale scores, which are kind of like the 3-digit numbers that we come out with in during NAPLAN time, and the rankings of kind of states or countries based on those scores, honestly the bane of my existence, because those average scores don't really tell us much about the spread. So you can have highly successful, high means that cover, really long tails or like a really big spread. And it's like, well, as Australia, we care about equity, so we're probably not going to go and do that, what that country's doing. But also we know that countries are really diverse. And sometimes the worst part of that sort of language is when we go down we need to be more like insert country here discourse, which is where you can end up going down some real rabbit holes, like with Finland, because Finland was apparently the most impressive country in the world about 20 years ago, and now nobody talks about it because guess what? It's had the biggest decline in PISA results since, or pretty much of all participating countries. So that means there are some kind of ways that when I get a big data set, when NAPLAN comes out or PISA comes out, what are the sort of things that I'm looking at? And I would draw conclusions on the basis of multiple data points, not just one. So one thing that obviously you have to look at mean performance. And like I said before, that's typically in all of the testing that we're going to be looking at today is presented in some sort of 3-digit scale score. Achievement and proficiency. So for all of these tests, there'll be some sort of level at which the kind of test designers and administrators have said, okay, here is the level at which we think if students have met this level, that means they're proficient. And if they, fall below this level, that means that they're not where they should be. So that might mean they're a little bit behind where they should be, or it might mean they're a lot behind where they should be, but it kind of depends on the test about how that's presented. A lot of tests will also talk about high and low performers. So it can also tell us what proportion is achieving at a high level, what proportion is achieving at a low level. Sometimes low performance usually both of these just ends up, they just give us some more depth, basically. And then performance of equity groups. Now that's fairly self-explanatory. We care about our vulnerable students and we care about our low performers because we want to know how they're benefiting under our current education system. So this year's NAPLAN. So many of you have probably seen that figure that's, in the headlines in all the newspapers, 1/3 of students not proficient. But if we unpack that a little bit further, what I've got on the screen there is basically reading at year 3, numeracy at year 3, and then doing reading and numeracy for 3, 5, 7, and 9. And what you see is that obviously if you were to kind of smush all of these figures together, you have about a third. But what I think is also really interesting is the fact that the needs additional support category, which are the students that are most behind, that is a solid 10% of students. Now, in a moment, we're going to look at some of the old NAPLAN data, and they had this national minimum standard measure, which everyone agreed was far too low. So, you know, whatever we might think of the value of that, I guess that proficiency measure, at the very least, I think we can all agree that that needs additional support category is much clearer for families as well about where their student might be. And of course, it kind of confirms what we already knew from last year. So should we compare this year's results with last year's? Why or why not? The answer is probably not, just because, I mean, we can, but we probably wouldn't learn much because you might have a couple of percentage point movement here and there. It won't tell us much. Now, this is our overall performance. We want to dig underneath that and look at our equity. So there's a lot of data on there. So I'm just going to give you guys time to have a look. So the thing that stands out to most people here is just the sheer magnitude of these gaps. So let's go over to the leftmost columns, First Nations versus non-First Nations students. Basically, and this is Australia-wide as well. So 2/3 of Indigenous students are not proficient compared to 2/3 of non-Indigenous students being proficient. So it's a complete inversion between First Nations and non-First Nations students. And if we look at the next two columns, parental education, so parents who, parents have a bachelor's degree, parents have a year 11 education or less. Having a parent who didn't complete year 12 makes you 3 times more likely to be not proficient than a student whose parents got a bachelor degree. Now, this is really controversial stuff because it's really easy to look at this data and think, oh, this is impossible. How can we close these gaps? And sometimes people take that to say that teaching is only a marginal factor in student outcomes, and we just need to invest in, broader things to improve social equality generally, and fix poverty, and teaching is kind of a marginal factor. But I look at this data, and to me, it says that what it means is that for some students, teaching matters way, way more than it does for others. And because if socioeconomic advantage is the sole predictor of educational success, then there's not really any way to explain this. So it's easy to miss this because of the fact that obviously so many of these bars are really, really high. But if we actually look at those numbers, and I appreciate it's sometimes hard to see, but it's about 19% at both year 3 and year 9 reading. That 19% of students whose parents have at least a bachelor's degree are still struggling with their reading. So what that means is that that's not explicable by saying that 1 in 5, that's obviously teaching, it has to matter for that to be the case. We're far exceeding the level that we would expect, of a diagnosed sort of learning difficulty. So teaching has to matter. And that means if whatever we do to help these groups here and bring down that proportion is also going to help us with all of the other groups that we can see on that screen. So obviously the annoying thing about changing the NAPLAN system is that we now have 2 different time series. And, going forward, it's going to be a bit harder to track things like the impact of kind of structured literacy policies and things like that. But I think there's still some really interesting things to look at from that first time series of 2008 to 2022. So I'm going to skip over the mean scale score and go straight to the national minimum standard. So I'll give you a moment to look at that. The short version is that students got better at year 3 and year 5. They didn't really change at all at year 7, and they went backwards at year 9. So we've got a slightly higher proportion, 92 to 95, meeting the national minimum standard. At year 5, it went 91 to 95. At year 7, it stayed at 94. At year 9, it went backwards from 93% to about 90%. So that's, you know, obviously good news for our primary teachers, but not so good news for our secondaries. We also want to look at the spread of achievement over time, because we also know that in the middle of this period, starting from about 2013, we had the Gonski funding that was intended to create that new schooling resource standard and provide more needs-based funding that accommodated or accounted for different student needs. Including the fact that, you know, obviously students from disadvantaged backgrounds would need further funding to support them. So have achievement gaps reduced? That's kind of one of the things we want to look at. And it's kind of hard to say, but you probably say that they haven't reduced, they haven't necessarily widened either. Now, the way that I've generated this, and this is obviously a little bit, this is probably the most complicated data we're going to look at in this presentation. The way that they present that by looking at the 5th, 20th, 80th, and 95th percentiles, remembering that those are ranked. So at the 95th percentile, what's the score? And I've compared them between 2008 and 2022. And basically what you see is that in 2008, the spread between the percentiles is 145 points. And then by 2022, it's slightly wider. We also want to look at gains across the achievement distribution. Now, for year 3, we already know that outcomes have gotten better, and that's great. So then we can actually compare the percentiles at 0.1, so 2008, and 0.2, 2022. What's happened? So what you can see is from that bottom green row is that, you know, they're all positive numbers. I've also color-coded them green so you can say, yay, that's a good thing. But those numbers are much bigger at the 95th percentile than they are at the 5th. So 60 points gain at the 95th percentile versus only 23.7 at the 5th. And I did it again for year 9, and it's less stark than it is at year 9. But we've already established that year 9 goes backwards, but what's driving that going backwards? And it's actually largely driven by a 20-point decline at that 5th percentile. Remember, our 5th percentile students are at the very, very bottom of the achievement distribution, at least as measured by NACLAN, and they went backwards, whereas, you know, across the other percentiles, there wasn't a huge amount of change. So that really suggests that those low performers are doing worse, and that's what's driven that change at year 9, which is really unfortunate because obviously the policy, you know, so much policy effort has been put in over the past like decade and a half to make that not the case. So quick engagement questions. What happened to primary reading in NACLAN? So primary reading being year 3 and year 5, have a think. It went up. So the percentage reaching the national minimum standard improved. What happened to the high performers in year 3 reading? We looked at that table. What happened to them? People who were already at the 95th percentile, they gained a lot more than their lower performing peers. So it's like I said, we need to look at that in the context of everyone doing better. But if we're also looking at this from the perspective of closing gaps, that's not necessarily the best outcome. What happened to low performers in year 3 reading? So our 5th percentile students, they went backwards by 20 points. Thanks, Kathleen. I'm loving your hand gestures there. So remember, we've kind of got a bit of a dichotomy set up between primary, you know, pretty positive, secondary, less positive. So now when we look at, you know, kind of our 15-year-olds, so that last year of kind of compulsory education in many countries, what does that look like? So the latest PISA release was in 2023 of data that was collected in 2022. There's additional focus, there's additional domain, there's additional data if it's a focus domain, which it wasn't until 2018. But so we're not going to look too much at some of the socioeconomics just because it just got too complicated. But I'll give you a little bit of a sense of what's measured. And I'll show you some of the test items from at least the 2018 test. And I'm not going to offer too much commentary on that, but I'll just obviously point out that you can see a little bit of a division between lower order and higher order, a variety of texts. And let's look at some of the questions. So PISA was being done online. And here you can see that one of the texts that they've used is an online forum. And it's basically asking questions around, you know, factual information, reliability, trustworthiness, relevance, and things like that. So you can see that this has been included to account for your new focus on digital literacy. That just gives you a bit of a picture of what kind of stuff they're being asked to do. But now let's look at performance. So since the first PISA in 2000, we've gone backwards. So in 2000, the mean scale score was 528. In 2022, it is 498. That is a 30-point gap. And ASA has determined, so the Australian Council for Educational Research, who does the PISA reporting, they determined this is equivalent to 1.5 years of schooling. And what's actually driven that? Has it been students at the top going backwards? Has it been students at the bottom going really, really backwards? What's happened? Students at all levels of achievement have declined. But we kind of see the opposite to what we saw with that year 3 reading. The lower performing students are declining more, have declined more. 45 points was a decline at the 10th percentile. And at the 90th percentile, it was only 18. Which isn't to say that, you know, only 18 is a good outcome, but relatively speaking, it does show that we've gotten worse at serving the bottom end of the student distribution. And obviously the outcome of all of that is that the gap between the top and the bottom performing students has gotten larger, which is really, again, counter to our stated goals of excellence and equity. We also can look at benchmark performance. Now, the benchmarks, I remember, they're quite useful. So those benchmarks, I think, are judgments like low, high, proficient, etc. But of course, like any sort of exercise in drawing boundaries, as anyone knows from trying to do reports, you know, it's kind of an imperfect science, and they're not the be all and end all. So let's look at low performance. So this is Australia-wide. Our low performers are the ones in grey. Our sort of middle performers that are not proficient are that sort of light beige colour. And then our proficient students are that sort of second dark, you know, I don't know, like kind of tan colour and darker. So low performers, that proportion's growing. So it's gone up from, at 2000, we see it's 12%, and it's gone up to 21% in the most recent PISA cycle. Then we look at proficiency. So what's the proportion of students that are actually on par? And that's set at level 3 or above. That's fallen from 69% to 57%. And then what's happened to our high performers? The proportion of high performers has decreased by 5 percentage points. So they've gone backwards from 17%. If you look at the bottom, sort of the bottom right there, and that's up to 9 plus 3, which is 12%. So that's not a great outcome. But again, we see that their decline, that high performance decline, is not as strong as it is for the lower levels. So let's evaluate our PISA performance and sum it all up. What's happened to our mean performance, our overall achievement of students at PISA reading? It's gone backwards. So 30 points, 1.5 years of schooling. What happened to proficiency? Also gone backwards. It's fallen from 69% to 57%. High and low performers, That's also gone backwards. So that means our low performers are getting bigger and our high performers are shrinking. So 12% up to 21%, and 17% down to 12% for our high performers. And our equity gaps, well, because we didn't have time, we didn't look at that socioeconomic data from like the last PISA sec. It's kind of hard to tell if we're trying to identify particular groups, but we do know that the 10th percentile of achievement fell by way more than the higher end of the distribution. So again, I'm giving that like a red decline arrow. But if that was depressing, it gets better, I promise. Let's look at Pearls quickly. Like PISA, Pearls is online now, and they have some slightly different way of organizing the test. So a little bit more multimedia friendly, and they have a lot more kind of open-ended questions. And with this particular thing, the first task was to look at Google, and it's like you've given the top 4 results on Google, which one's the best one. So it's a full kind of thing where you're being asked to look at a whole bunch of different things. But what's actually happened with results? So Pearls generally has improved while PISA has declined. And that kind of aligns with what we saw with NAPLAN, right? We had good outcomes for primary at year 7 and backwards at year 9. And so this kind of maps onto what NAPLAN is telling us. So just to explain that dotted line, it doesn't mean that the results are somehow not trustworthy. It just means that the testing was done slightly later in the year because of disruption from COVID, and that was the case across many of the Pearls participating countries. Now, the good news is that there was a big improvement from 2011 to 2016, but there was no change from 2016 to 2021, at least at that mean level. Proficiency. Now, this is slightly easier to interpret than the PISA ones because red is not proficient and green is proficient. So it's divided into 5 bands. Below, low, and low are both considered our non-proficient / low performers. And then anything in green, which is our intermediate, high, and advanced, is considered proficient. And at the moment, the most recent says that we are at 1 in 5. And I'll show you what it looks like over time in a moment. But first, I want you guys to look at the description of the intermediate and the high benchmarks. So the intermediate's on the bottom and the high is on the top. So if you do want to share any of your thoughts in the chat, I would really encourage that. But I'm sort of looking at this, and to me, it seems like there's a big jump between the skills and capacities required at intermediate and the skills and capacities required at high. So the text difficulty level, for instance, at intermediate, it's easy or medium. And then what they need to do with the text, like locate and recognize and reproduce explicitly stated interactions, making straightforward inferences. Whereas at high, it seems like quite a big jump. Now, I sort of think that this intermediate is maybe a little bit, like it's higher than basic, but to me, it looks a little bit low for saying, yeah, this kid's on track for year 4. But remember that in spite of that, and this is just my opinion looking at it, and I'm not a primary school teacher, so I'd really welcome your thoughts on this. It shows that we know that 1 in 5 students is still not meeting that intermediate range. So it does show that although that Pearls data looks better than NAPLAN, we still have to kind of always take these things with a grain of salt and dig into, well, what is this actually measuring? And the results are more positive than PISA, that's for certain. Our high and low performers, they fall from 24% to 20%. But the less good news is that the number of students or the proportion of students at the very bottom, our below low, is at the same, is at 6 or 7%. Sue's saying, I also think the intermediate seems low. They are lower level skills, like straightforward inferences about easy or intermediate texts. That's exactly what I thought, Sue. And then obviously that high one, not only is it a different level of text complexity, it's also a higher level of task complexity as well. So to me, it seems like a really big jump. And I was discussing this with my former colleague Jennifer Buckingham, and she was like, yeah, it's always harder when there's fewer bands, because obviously by definition, the fewer bands you have, the more stuff gets squished into the same category and it becomes less easy to interpret. But back to the results. So below low, that's really sad. So it just shows that there's that sort of bottom 6 to 7% of achievement that we haven't really been able to budge. On the other hand, the high is pretty good, up from 42 to 48. So our evaluation of Pearl. So summing it up, mean performance, what's happened there? It's gone up just a little bit, 13 score points. What's happened to achievement of proficiency overall? It's gone up. It's not a huge jump though. It used to be 24% and now it's 20, sorry. This used to be 24% not proficient and now it's 20% not proficient. What happened to the proportions of high and low performers? Well, we'll skip the low performers because it's the same thing with Pearls. But that advanced band has definitely gone up. So what are some of the key takeaways from all of that? So we've looked at, we've gone through heaps and heaps of data. So this is like the kind of pause point, take a breath, have a think. If you want to put something in the chat, you can. Yes, so it is complex, which is why it's sometimes unfortunate that we can, and I understand why this happens. It's like we kind of need to have like the really kind of clear, I guess, what's the key takeaway, the headline figure, but it does mean that it's harder to kind of draw clear conclusions. But of course, it's easier to sort of say, if you've got NAPLAN saying something and Pearls is saying something as well, and it does sort of indicate that there has been a general improvement over the last sort of decade and a half in primary school reading. But the older kids, of course, as you're saying, it's very, very hard. Like you can't catch up at year 10. You're not doing catch up at year 10. At that point, like a student, like I don't want to sound dramatic, but at that point, we know where the students are kind of being directed into particular pathways based on their literacy and numeracy. Like that's just the reality for anyone who's worked in a secondary school. I've seen it happen. I've seen kids that can't read properly at year 7 and not getting the proper intervention because we didn't know what it was. So yeah. And yes, the equity gaps are huge. So let's bear all of that in mind when we look at Victoria. There's someone's actually accidentally written on the screen and I'm trying to figure out how to like do it. I can't. I used to be such a pro at PowerPoint when I was teaching and now I'm just like blah, blah, blah. I don't know how to make this work anymore. Anyway, it's okay. It's just a couple of yellow lines. We'll live. Yeah, I agree, Kathleen. It makes me very frustrated and sad for lower achieving students that in spite of the fact that we've worked so hard at that sort of high policy level to try and catch them up, it obviously hasn't kind of filtered down to what we're doing in the classroom and enough, or at least not enough to kind of make a difference. So we'll go into Victoria and there's a few kind of key things that I want to point out before we do that, because it provides useful context. So Victoria, first of all, most demographically advantaged state in the nation. I'll tell you why that is in a moment. And of course, despite the claims of NAPLAN success we get every year, once you adjust the NAPLAN data for advantage, it's not as positive, particularly at a secondary level. And this kind of adds to our primary okay, secondary less good. International testing data is also hardly kind of singing the praises of Victoria. And this is, I think, maybe the worst outcome. There's a recent audit report that came out in May, and that shows achievement gaps have widened. So demographic advantages, we calculate that by looking at the socio-educational advantage. Now, you guys will all be familiar with the ICSIA, which is basically this information translated into an index that is used to rank all of the schools across the country. And all of this is just shows that what are the kind of socio-educational advantages. And let's look at where the bottom groups are. So this one's alphabetical order, which is slightly annoying. So Victoria's in the sort of second last column there, 27% in the bottom quarter and 26% in the lower middle. If we know that obviously quarters are quarters and you would expect 25, 25, 25, 25 as the average, Victoria is the closest to that in terms of the overall kind of reflection. ACT has got the lowest proportions. In terms of what would be a fair comparison to make in Victoria, to be honest, none of these states are really kind of similar. Victoria is in a bit of a league of its own, but if I had to take a gamble, I would say New South Wales, because it's got it's also the biggest economy, which means that it's got the most wealth. So wealth-wise, Victoria and New South Wales are much more demographically, are comparable. And when you add the demographics in, I think New South Wales is still the best metric for comparison. So Sarah's asked a question about the number of schools. The data about the samples, this is about the data of the number of schools that completed PISA and PIRLS. Absolutely. So there's always a danger that if the sampling is bad, that it can make the outcomes look really kablooey. But that's why, and that's another reason why I don't take movement between one cycle and the next too seriously. But if there is a general trend that we can see, from PISA, we're looking at a trend that's over 2 decades old. PIRLS less so because it's only 3 data points. But that makes me think that there's actually something to this. It's not just really big sampling mistakes from one year to another. So that information about who's in the sample doesn't tell you exactly which schools they are, but they do publish that information in the report, and the report links are at the end of the presentation. I've converted this to a PDF as well, so I'll upload it in the Facebook group, or it can be emailed around. We'll do whatever. So a significant proportion of that sort of socio-educational advantage equation is actually what we call geolocation. And that's essentially the ABS kind of measurements of across 5 categories. So they divide all of Australia into major cities, inner regional, outer regional, remote, very remote. And I've zoomed in on Victoria there, and you can see that from a geographical standpoint, the vast majority of our population, so that would includes our major cities, our biggest regional centres, are all kind of classified as major cities or inner regional. We don't have many. We have a few like geographically large, but population-wise not so large in outer regional, and almost none in in remote. And I looked at this in terms of how many students sat NAPLAN in Victoria in 2024 from outer regional, from remote Australia, from remote Victoria. Oh, forgive me, it's that time of day. And it's like 40 kids. Like they don't even report it for some of them because it's just so low. Like it's like 37 kids, 40 kids that are enrolled to sit NAPLAN. And so, well, going back here to this element of disadvantage, when we see stuff like this is just committing that cardinal sin of using those mean scale scores to create the rankings. And it's like, government's going to government. That's kind of their job, to toot their own horn and stuff. But it does make it hard. And this has been the case for a very long time, as anybody who's been trying to make a move on reading instruction knows, is that the very obvious pushback is, but we don't have a problem because we're top of the class in NAPLAN. And that has been a real, and I think that's the biggest thing that upsets me when we don't look deeper. Yes, it's more time consuming, but if we don't actually look deeper, then we don't have the accurate information that we can use to judge policy and figure out where it should go. We're just kind of running out of time here, so I'm just going to skip this one because it's really obvious. New South Wales is the most is the most similar, but still not very similar. And I want you to bear that in mind as we look at what we're about to look at. So this is some data which is not really published anywhere else. I've put it into a submission that I made to a parliamentary inquiry, but it's not published in a report or anything else. So if you want a copy of this data, I can send you the submission, or you can just have access to this PDF for this presentation. So the charts that I'm about to show you are based on an aggregation of the school level data on My School. So we know that when you go onto My School, you look at NAPLAN, achievement, it shows you basically your green, your white, and your red shaded bands. So your greens are this school's punching above its weight, white is punching in its weight class, and red is like punching below its weight, insofar as, you know, we'd ever use that expression. And when we look at that, and it's kind of obviously weighted by student numbers and things like that to give you an impression of how many schools, how many students in how many schools. And year 3 reading is actually pretty good. I have my theories about that, but this is actually really good news. It shows we want small red and big green. So that's what, if you're only glancing at these and the numbers are like overwhelming, small red, big green, that's what we want. And Victoria has a very small red and a pretty big green for year 3 reading. And year 3 numeracy, on the other hand, and I've included numeracy here, first of all, because I support a change to learn Ballarat too. But secondly, I think it's important to have context for what we do. And obviously, all primary school teachers teach both. So all of it's relevant to you. So year 3 numeracy, we definitely see a slight weakness. So you can see that Victoria has a slightly larger red than New South Wales. It's definitely still smaller than a lot of the other states and territories, like the ACT, man. This is what bad teaching gets you. Look at that for the ACT, so bad. Anyway, sorry, this is not about looking down at the ACT. So, oofed, I know, it's bad. But, you know, this is the sort of data that gets shared with the people who are running the directorate, and then they're like, ooh. So that's why we have change happening in the ACT, which is great. I wish them all very, you know, fondest wishes and best wishes to them. So slight weakness in numeracy, relatively still looking good in year 3 reading. Excellent. And I'll just point out that this is an aggregation of data from 2019 to 2022. So this is 2019, 2021, and 2022 data that's been smushed to get this result. So it's not a single point in time. Let's look at year 9 now. And I can see that, like, yeah, we've got Shay there who's at secondary school. Oh, here, oh no, there was someone that I've missed. Oh dear. I'm very sorry, Melissa, if I've left you waiting there for a really long time. In any case, the presentation is recorded and we can have a look at it at any time. And please accept my strongest apologies. I got a bit distracted presenting. So year 9. Year 9 reading we're starting to look a lot more similar to some of the other states. So remember that we said what we said about New South Wales and Victoria sort of being the ones that are the most comparable. You see slightly bigger red than New South Wales and about the same level of green. So 1 in 4 schools are performing below or well below similar schools when it comes to secondary, when it comes to year 9 reading. And remember, this is after, and obviously we're going to look at numeracy in a second, but also bear in mind that we put a whole bunch of money into Mylands, the middle years literacy and numeracy strategy, which is supposed to rectify this sort of stuff. And maybe it was worse before, I don't know. Maybe it was worse before Mylands, and Mylands has only had a little bit of an impact. But in any case, I think it's very hard to argue that this has been successful, because we've got WA, Tasmania, the NT, and New South Wales all will have lower proportions of schools underperforming on this measure. And remember, all of this, when I say underperforming, I'm talking about relative to schools that are similar to of those demographics. So you could have disadvantaged schools in those red pockets and really advantaged schools in those red pockets. It doesn't matter who the schools are. It just matters where they're sitting relative to schools that are like them. And numeracy. So a third of schools are performing below or well below, and compare this to a fifth in New South Wales and just 6% in WA. So WA has obviously worked some sort of magic with its secondary school students, and it would be really nice if we had like a system of university, you know, senior secondary university entrance that actually enabled people to sort of make comparisons between that to see if that actually carries through past year 9. But I mean, it doesn't exist, so we can't tell. Engage, true or false. We're just running out of time, so we'll race through these. We perform relatively well compared to other states on year 3 reading. That is true, we do. Our numeracy performance is about as strong as our reading. That's not quite true. It's slightly weaker in year 3, and by the time you get to year 9, it's ooh. Primary schools, now this is a controversial point, and I do not mean to offend anybody. For me as a former secondary teacher, this hurts me to see this. But I think it's fair to say that Victoria's primary schools have, and this is also not just taking just this data, but everything we've seen so far seems to me that Victoria's primary schools are overall able to deliver better outcomes, which of course it's much harder to catch kids up at year 7 and year 9, but yes. PISA reading, we'll race through this so we can get through, race through PISA and Pearls so we can get through to the audit report, which I think is really interesting. Basically, the key takeaway from the PISA reading is that the demographic advantage that Victoria hasn't translated into an advantage even at that average level. So remember how I said, oh, you know, mean scale scores are not very good if they show Victoria up the top. These scale scores are not showing Victoria up the top. They're showing Victoria very similar, and it's showing that Victoria is not kind of punching where it should be. So 2 points ahead of New South Wales and 4 points behind WA, that's not a difference really, that's the same. And we see the same thing in the proficient standards. So the WA is up to 60%, Victoria is 59%, New South Wales is 58%, Australian average is also 58%. Now this is something to think about. Why is it important to look beyond a mean scale score that's stable over time before concluding that outcomes haven't shifted? Why might it be important? Think about some of the stuff that we've looked at before. Why is this helpful? Essentially, it's kind of what we talk about when we talk about an average. An average can represent a very, very wide spread, and high achieving students can move up and lower achieving students can move down, but the mean can stay the same. So we need to look at other measures, and that's why we want to make sure we're triangulating our conclusions based on multiple data points. So proficiency, changes in high and low performance. So this chart that I've shown you there ranks the states and territories by proficiency, and that's basically the number on the right-hand side. And you can see that Victoria is not much different. This supports that idea that supports that in the middle idea that we've talked about. Yes, sir, it does mean that the means don't tell you everything. That's really important to remember. So what we're kind of trying to achieve is that we want them to move the curve towards the right? Like we want more students in the orange and fewer students in that gray. And so that's when we can look at high and low performers to sort of help us draw that conclusion, like what's going on there. We want to minimize our low performers, maximize our high performers. And so our proportion of high performers, so that's the orange bars on this chart here. Oh, sorry, our high performers haven't really changed meaningfully. So that's that sort of that middle column on that Victoria chart on the right-hand side. We've got a string of numbers. They move around a bit, but they don't change hugely over time. But if we look at our low performers, from 2000, they were 14%, and by 2022, they're 20%. That's a big concern because that shows that and because it goes with a reduction in people in students who are attaining the proficient standard as well, even though that does move around a little bit, it shows that there's a significant group of students in the distribution, maybe not the top ones, but a significant proportion that are moving down the curve, which is not what we want to see. Pearls, big one here is the decline between 2016 and 2021. Why did that happen? Essentially, our high achievers fell. So I apologize for the slightly wonky screenshotting there, but this is from the ASA report. They've our advanced achievers, so that went from 19% to just 13%. Our low performers haven't moved around quite as much. But again, just like with the national average, our low performers, our below low has gone from 5 to 3 to 4. So even that is something that's bounced around a little bit. High performance is stable. Low performers have increased to 20% in PISA literacy. What drove the decrease in the Pearls mean? That is the students at the top. Audit report. Okay, so to give you guys a bit of background about what the audit report does and who the Auditor General is, basically an independent statutory agency, their job is to sort of be independent of all of the government departments and agencies and look independently and assess independently their work. So they might look at stuff that's, fancy new projects that cost a lot of money, or they might look at particular programs. They looked at the Tutor Learning Initiative, and happy to chat offline about that one. But they have some standing reporting expectations. They do reviews on an as-needs basis. Why they chose to do this one, I don't know. But this is what they said. They examined whether the Department of Education is improving literacy and numeracy achievement outcomes for all Victorian government school students. So the interesting thing about this is that it uses some of the old NAPLAN data for government school students only. And because that's just kind of part of their remit as the Auditor General, they focused more on state government, state schools. So this is what they found. Findings 1 to 3 relate to student outcomes, and finding 4 is more of like a bureaucratic thing, so we won't talk about that. Basically, stable outcomes, not improving outcomes for our vulnerable student groups, which is Aboriginal students and students experiencing disadvantage. And they've also did a little bit of a rate of learning estimate, which I'm not going to cover here because it's a bit, I don't love the way they presented it in the report, and it's a bit hard to interpret. But basically, they're not learning at a rate that's going to close the gap. So when it's not really achieving, particularly that goal in the education state, which is about breaking the link between SES and educational outcomes, that basically the Auditor General says that it's very hard to conclude that this is being successful. So here are the charts. I'm going to race through them because we're heading on to 5:30. It's the national minimum standard. So whether students are meeting it or not, remembering this is a low bar, but it's old NAPLAN, so we have to use it. Year 3, all students are the black line. Our EAL is the teal line, and you can see very interestingly how they track each other quite well. And then we have our disadvantage level 1 and disadvantage level 2. So essentially, it's those disadvantage levels are like parental education and parental occupation, and it's sort of like a mishmash of some of those factors. Level 1 is a higher level of disadvantage, and level 2 is a lower level. And we can see that we've definitely got Aboriginal students, disadvantage level 1 and disadvantage level 2, achieving at they're being less likely to kind of meet the national minimum standard. And then in year 5, we can see more or less the same thing. The gaps are slightly wider, but not hugely wide. But you can definitely see that from the start of the kind of data collection, which is 2012, or the start of the reporting period, things are definitely getting better. Like it's not amazing, but it's definitely getting better for at least some of those groups across the time period. But of course, we're now going to go into secondary. And if your thinking is, I reckon the gaps are going to get wider, then you would be right. So this is really interesting here at year 7, because look at what's happened sort of since like kind of 2019 COVID time, pretty much all students have gotten slightly worse. They're slightly less likely to meet that national minimum standard, but it's kind of a steeper line for our Aboriginal students especially, but also our disadvantaged students. And what it means is that the gain that sort of was created between, say, like 2012 and 2017, so in the first half of that period, they've kind of gone down, and then they're back to where they were at 2017 in the middle of that reporting period. So Aboriginal students are actually slightly higher. So that's a bit of a disappointing outcome for the results to bounce around and then kind of end up back where they started. But in year 9, we're not talking about a regression like we were at year 7. It's literally the worst. It's very, very bad. It's kind of the worst that they've ever been. So, this black line here, all students, is around 10%, and that kind of matches what we saw in the national NAPLAN results from 2022. But for our Aboriginal students, I mean, a quarter of them are not meeting the national minimum standard. And as we've talked about, that national minimum standard is very, very low. So it just shows, if you just compare the way that the lines will sit together at year 3 and then the way the lines sit together at year 9, it's just, the gaps just keep getting wider and wider over time. Now, I've gone a couple of minutes over time, and so there may be questions or comments, and I would really welcome anything. On the other hand, hang on, can I put my email address in here? You can also email me at this email address I am writing up on the screen right now. Sorry, that's an @ symbol there, that's squiggle. It's tjar@cis.org.au. Now, my name on Facebook was kind of just for anonymity, is my married name, Brettig, but this is my legal name, and this is how you can find me. So I've got the further reading, so some research and analysis reports that, ways of interpreting and using that data, including that Auditor General report in there. And then I've got the actual results reports all listed there that I've used. So thank you. If there's any questions, otherwise, thank you very much for attending.